And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the television show that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. On this episode of Chapters, we're going to be talking about food, Barcelona, history, and culture with Dr. Montserrat Miller, history professor at Marshall University, and we're going to be talking about her book, Feeding Barcelona, Public Market Halls, Social Networks, and Consumer Culture. And Montserrat Miller earned her PhD in history at Carnegie Mellon. She's a professor of history at Marshall University, specializing in modern Europe, and her research concentrates on 19th and 20th century Catalonia, on food markets, gender, and consumer culture. And we are delighted to have her here to talk about this outstanding book. And Montserrat, welcome to Chapters. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So tell me a little bit about where the idea for this book came from and what inspired you to write it.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm originally from Wayne County, West Virginia. I grew up in a little bend in the road on Route 75, a place called Shoals. And my father was from that area. His family been there for many generations. But my mother was from Barcelona. And so when I was young, my mother did not speak any English. And so in our household, the Catalan language was the predominant language, although my parents spoke to one another in Spanish, which is a completely separate language, although also derived from Latin Vulgar. And the kids, we spoke to one another in English for the most part. And after many years of scrimping and saving and my father working second and third jobs, we finally were able to visit my mother's family in Barcelona in the summer of 1967. And I was quite struck by the beauty of the city, by the intensity of the city, and by many of the contrasting elements of the culture. Perhaps the most significant being the way in which people ate and the way in which people shopped for food. So that was the beginning, 1967. I was a 7-year-old child.
Fantastic. And I know that you went through a pretty interesting process in terms of researching and writing this book before we get into some of the specifics. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, when it started and the process from the time you got the idea to the first manuscript to the final publication?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting tale, and I'm so very happy that it's finally out, of course. But I did a bachelor's in international affairs here at Marshall, and then I did a master's in history here at Marshall. But I was an American historian, and I wrote a master's thesis on a Civil War topic. And then I went on to do to work on my doctorate at Carnegie Mellon University. And Carnegie Mellon is a really innovative place, and they encourage their students to think outside the box. And so I had just read, in my first semester at Carnegie Mellon, I had just read Fernand Braudel's 3-volume masterpiece called Civilization and Capitalism, 15th through 18th Centuries. And in the course of reading those 3 volumes, I was struck by the importance of public markets in the origin of urban life and in the expansion of urban life in that early modern period. And so I asked myself, logically, if markets were so important in the early modern period, what was their significance then in the modern period or in an industrial context? And I searched for studies on the question and came up empty-handed. I found one thing on French urban marketplaces, but it was a sociolinguistic study, certainly not a history or a social history. And so I set about researching the topic and theme at a time when there was no literature of a historical nature covering this, no specific archives that one could point to in writing grant applications to ask for funding, and no debates or burning questions in the field. So I was met with some skepticism from the faculty, but ultimately the chair of the department at the time, Peter Stearns, who's a very innovative thinking, he embraced my enthusiasm, my interest, and so I was off to the races. And before long, I'd secured a Fulbright fellowship to spend a year studying and interviewing market vendors in Barcelona. And then ultimately, in 1994, I completed a doctoral dissertation on the subject, and then went on to my first job, which was in Texas, at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. Then after 2 years, I came back to Marshall, And I got busy teaching classes and working on tenure and writing articles and doing other shorter pieces, but I never forgot about my interest in the markets. And eventually I began to do more grant writing and spent more time in Barcelona and did more and more research. And finally, in 2006, I had a completed book manuscript that looked nothing like the dissertation. And so I shopped it around a little bit and got responses from a few publishers, but didn't really make a lot of headway. And in 2009, LSU Press contacted me, and of their own volition, interestingly enough, and they were very enthusiastic about the book, and so I entered into an exclusive relationship with them, and they sent it out for what's called peer review. So they sent it to 2 experts in the field, and the first response was really positive. They said, that reader said, publish this. There's nothing like it in any language. Absolutely, yes, it's a go. So I was really pleased with that. Then I had to wait a few more months for the second reader. And the second reader was much more diligent and much more detailed in formulating a response. I think it was 9 pages, single-spaced document of commentary on my book. And that reviewer also said, this must be published, this deserves to come out. Chapters 6 and 7 are particularly engaging. The front part of the book might need some work, and that reader offered me some really specific and meaningful recommendations. And so everybody around me said, oh yeah, just sort of, smooth it out a bit, address what you can. But I had a sabbatical at the time, and I took the second reader's recommendations to heart. So I sat down and, for the most part, set aside the 2006 manuscript and rewrote it for a third time.
Wow.
And then this is the result of that. Of course, I had to also take 100 pages out after I had rewritten it, but here we are finally at the end of a very, very long journey that started as an idea one night in January of 1990 and was issued as a LSU book in January of 2015. So
That's amazing that it was a 25-year process really from the time you got the idea all the way to the final publication. That's very interesting.
For a long time, I was kind of embarrassed to admit how long I'd been working on the book because it's not supposed to take that long. But I think that the results show the investment of time, and there are certainly arguments and chapters here that would not have been possible in the late 1990s or the early 2000s. And so now it's almost like a special badge of courage and persistence that it took a quarter century to produce.
It's great. Well, it is a terrific work. It really is. And
thank you.
And you can tell all the hard work that you put into it paid off. I wanted to ask you, you focus on the years 1714 to 1975 in this book. Why that period of history, and what was really going on in Barcelona, during that time as you moved through the 18th and 19th, 20th century?
Yes. Well, 1714 marks the end of what's called the War of the Spanish Succession. And this was a great conflict that took place as the Habsburg dynasty came to an end with the death of Carlos II without issue. And so the throne then passed to Philip V of the Bourbon line, grandson of Louis XIV. And so at that moment in Spain's history, the ascension of the Bourbons to the crown, there is a political set of changes. There are a political set of changes brought about, the beginning of a very serious process of centralization. And what that meant in Catalonia was that Catalonia is the region, of course, of which Barcelona is capital. What that meant was that their historical charters, liberties, and political institutions were all suspended. And the Catalan language itself was forbidden in use in politics and juridical documents. Later on in the 18th century, it was prohibited in education. So it's a period of time from 1714 to 1975 in which the people of Barcelona can no longer elect their own mayor. The mayor's appointed from Madrid, with the exception of a brief time in the 1930s under the Second Republic. Those dates, 1714 to 1975, are important, but they don't tell the whole story, because I go back quite a bit before 1714. I actually begin with the 10th century in terms of telling the story of Barcelona's history through the lens of its provisioning system. And then at the end of the book, I continue in the conclusion up until 2013. So those dates are worth considering, because I'm mainly looking at the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. But I do pay a good bit of attention to quite a few centuries leading up to that as well.
One thing that caught my attention, going to the 20th century for just a moment in your book, is this idea of the public market model. Mm-hmm. and what was going on there. Can you explain a little bit about what that was and how that impacted Barcelona and the food industry and the marketing
Sure.
of food during that time?
Yeah, this notion of a public market model of food retailing is one that dates to the late 18th century, and we see it first in England and in France. And this public market model of food retailing is based on the notion that public markets should be contained in physical structures, in market halls. Markets themselves are, of course, much older. We can go back to Sumeria in 3200 BCE and find a public market model there. But the more modern version to which I am referring holds that markets should be held indoors in an enclosed structure, that they should be regulated, that the commodities for sale should be protected from the inclement weather, and there are really two ways of envisioning that model. One is the British model, which holds that the public market should be on a high street in the center of town, and people should travel into the center of town to go to market, versus the Parisian model, which is a polynuclear model. It holds that there should be also a central market, Les Halles, for example, in the case of Paris, but also a whole network of neighborhood market halls that residents can reach on foot, near their homes, and that provisioning should be thus decentralized. So this is an innovation we find in Britain and France, and it is adopted a bit later in Spain and in the Mediterranean world. In the case of Barcelona, we see the polynuclear French market hall model of food retailing embraced in the second half of the 19th century. And it's largely as a consequence of ongoing, simmering social unrest, violent protest, that the city takes the reins of the provisioning system. And even though there are shops and stores, they guarantee access to food all across the city through these municipally operated and owned public market halls.
Very interesting. One of the things that was unique in reading your book is how people gravitated, even in Barcelona during this period, around food and around the idea of getting food. And I think about our Appalachian culture. We build a lot of our family relationships and our activities and events around food. Mm-hmm. What did you learn about that process, and what is it about food that gets people together, gets people excited, gets people wanting to build something around what are we going to eat?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm a Hispalachian, or I consider myself a Hispalachian, that is a Hispanic Appalachian, and certainly food was central to my upbringing in Wayne County. Our family got together a lot for breakfast, and my great-grandmother made homemade biscuits, and there was a lot of love that filled the dining room at my grandmother and my great-grandmother's home. And I saw the same thing in Barcelona, but it was a little different in that the midday meal took place between 2 and 4. And so it was a much longer process at the table. And then there's something in both Catalan and Spanish, and I think broader Hispanic culture as well, that's called la sobretaula or la sobremesa, which means that once you've consumed all the food, then you stay at the table for an extended period of time. And that might go on for hours and hours on the weekend. And also, food was served in Barcelona at my family's table in multiple small courses. The servings could be, smaller than we'd see in Wayne County, but there was more elaboration in the cooking, and there was more ritual associated with the delivery of the food. And as I was soon to discover, food shopping took place 6 days a week. There wasn't the weekly supermarket trip. Rather, there was a daily public market trip. And my family's home in Barcelona was located within a block and a half of one of these markets, La Concepción, which was inaugurated in 1888. It's a beautiful market still today, very vibrant. And 6 days a week, my Catalan aunt would go to the market, and she relished the process of shopping because she would talk to, a half dozen people on the way to the market, and then she only bought from specific stalls, and there was no comparison shopping, and she'd stand in line at the stall, and there'd be lots of conversation between those standing in line, and standing in line was considered a fun thing. Efficiency, meant nothing there. And then once she got to the head of the line, she would ask the vendor for advice. I think I'll make this today. How do you think I should do it? Is that a good idea? And it was kind of a rhetorical thing. She knew perfectly well what she was doing. But the point was to engage the vendor in a form of ritualized exchange and humor that was enjoyable for everybody. And then we'd haul the basket back home. It might have taken an hour and a half to do this. And then somehow my aunt would miraculously turn that fare into a splendid meal, sometimes for 10, 12, or 14 people at a time. So it was slow food. We talk about slow food today. They certainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, in my family, were embracing slow food with much enthusiasm before the term had been even coined.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you to go back to a point that you were talking about a moment ago with sort of the social unrest, going back to the 20th century for a minute. You mentioned in your book the Primo de Rivera dictatorship, which was from 1923 to 1930, and of course a lot of folks remember from World War II, Franco was another dictator in the country or in that region during that time. What was going on in the Primo de Rivera dictatorship and the market-based sort of cultural expressions during that time, and what was his role, what was the government's role? You mentioned that they had a lot of influence in what was going on with the sort of the public market concept. What happened and what was going on then?
Well, the Primo de Rivera dictatorship began in 1923, as you noted, and basically it was an attempt to resolve the social conflict that had so intensified after World War I. Spain was neutral in World War I, but World War I did not have a neutral effect on Spain because Spain produced various types of commodities, textiles, airplane engines, and a wide variety of food that went to supply the belligerents in World War I. And so certain companies became enriched as a consequence of the war, and then the fact that wealth was so unevenly distributed meant that vicious rounds of inflation made life very difficult for the poor, and that inflation was felt first at the dinner table. So there were soaring prices, and wages did not keep up with them. So there's a lot of unrest between 1917 and 1923 in Spain, and many elites in Spain feared that something akin to the Russian Revolution was about to happen. And, there were bread riots of the sort that often spark, revolutions such as the French Revolution, and in fact, even constituted a trigger for the Russian Revolution. Bread riots in Barcelona in particular, and some other Spanish cities, and ultimately then General Primo de Rivera, Miguel Primo de Rivera, stepped in to suspend constitutional liberties and clamp down on labor and clamp down on the right of free association and free press and so forth. He immediately, in terms of Barcelona, he immediately suspended the use of the Catalan language in government, which had been restored in the early years of the 20th century for a brief period. So if you look at the records from about 1910 to about 1923, the administration of the markets is conducted in Catalan. Castilian Spanish is reimposed the next day after the coup d'etat. And Primo de Rivera was also very interested in fomenting Spanish nationalism and trying to sweep Catalan nationalism under the rug. Mm-hmm. And so he undertook any number of measures to build a Spanish identity. And in so doing, one of the things that he targeted was the markets and the market vendors. And so he used them, he used his regime and the municipal governments operating under his auspices, used the markets and the market vendors of the city in a wide-ranging array of rituals that were meant to convey the government's commitment to the well-being of the citizenry through the regulation of these markets located all across the city. So that included, the book starts out with a story about a beauty pageant. Mm-hmm. And in fact, just near the very end of the regime, they hold a pageant where each of the markets is to elect the prettiest young vendor in the market, and they dress her in white, and then they parade the market queens to the streets of the city, and then they have a ball in the National Palace, and King Alfonso XIII comes from Madrid to the pageant, and they select the queen of all the queens of the market, and then she gets to dance with the king. She's just a lowly fruit and vegetable vendor from a market on the outskirts of the city, and she gets to dance with the King of Spain. And little did she know that, her reign would last a year. So for a year, she got to go to municipal events and receptions. She was whisked away at night in black cars, taken to bullfights and concerts. She got to ride in an airplane. She was queen of all the queens of the market. But within a year's time, before her reign was actually up, Alfonso XIII had to give up his throne and flee the country in fear because municipal elections had swept Republican candidates into office. And if there's one thing that any king fears, it's republicanism and regicide. Mm-hmm. So off he went. He did not actually abdicate, but he lived out his life in Rome. And ultimately, his grandson assumed the throne of Spain at the death of Franco in 1975. Actually, the coronation was before, but anyway, he took over and ushered Spain towards democracy at Franco's death. But it is a very rich Republican fantasy to imagine that this lowly market vendor is elected as queen, mm-hmm. and her reign outlives that of the actual King of Spain. And so I thought that was a really interesting story to tell, to open the book. Mm-hmm. It's a vignette that I offer. And because I'm writing, this book is written for a scholarly and an academic audience, but it's also written for my family. Mm-hmm. It's written for my mother, it's written for my aunt, it's written for my West Virginia cousins, my aunts and uncles, and I intentionally sought to write it for the people who had encouraged me and the people I cared about, to sort of share some of my Catalan culture with my family and friends here in West Virginia. So for that reason, I really wanted to emphasize storytelling and the narrative arc, as opposed to, a sort of a heavy quantitative analysis or some sort of tedious story-graphic argument. And I try to keep that to the minimum.
Yeah. And I love that vignette at the beginning, because a lot of us remember from our history classes in high school and college about some of the bad actors and the countries involved during World War I and World War II during the upheaval. But, we forget about countries like Spain that were overlooked, that were also going through a lot of social unrest and things of that nature that you were talking about. So I found that really interesting in your book. Montserrat, as we finish up with you in our final moments, if someone in our audience would like to get in contact with you to learn more about your writing or your book, or if they'd like to get a copy of Feeding Barcelona, where can they do that? How can they get in contact with you?
Well, sure. I'm easy to find because I'm on the faculty of the Department of History at Marshall. So all you have to do is go to www.marshall.edu and go to the history webpage, and you'll find my email address there. It's milleram@marshall.edu, and I check my email every day. And I'm eager to hear from readers. The book is available here at Empire Books and News, and will continue to be so, I understand. We sold an awful lot of copies last Friday at my book signing. We sold, I believe, 56 copies.
That's terrific.
So we had a great success, great turnout. I was really pleased. It's also available online from LSU Press. It's available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble. It's available in Kindle, Nook editions. And it's also available at the Marshall University bookstore, Books A Million. It's pretty easy to find, new and used, electronic and hard. So if any viewer would like to talk about my book, or how a girl from Wayne County writes a book about Barcelona's provisioning system, I'd just be thrilled to engage in that conversation.
Well, it is a terrific book, and I certainly hope our audience will take a moment to look at it and to read it, because you learn a lot about not only another culture and another part of the world, but tying in a lot of those common threads that a lot of us remember from studying history, 20th century history, and 18th and 19th century history as well. Dr. Montserrat Miller from Marshall University, author of Feeding Barcelona, from 1714 to 1975, Public Market Halls, Social Networks, and Consumer Culture, published by Louisiana State University Press. Thank you so much for being on Chapters. It was a pleasure having you, and we'll keep tabs on what you're doing, and the next book you write, we'll certainly have you back on to talk about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And lastly, we want to take a moment to say thanks to the staff and management at Empire Books and News for providing our studio taping space today, as well as on-site technical support and behind-the-scenes support. We appreciate that so much. We encourage you to stop by Empire Books and News to pick up a copy of Dr. Miller's book, and also many of the authors and publishers that you've seen featured on Chapters have their works for sale here at Empire Books and News. So we encourage you to stop by and look into those books and check those out. And they also have the largest selection of magazines in the tri-state. That's available for you here at Empire Books and News. So we encourage you to stop by, talk to Charlotte and her staff, and let them get you taken care of for all of your reading needs. And if you'd like to reach out to us here on the show, we've made it very easy for you to do so. All you need to do is send us an email to the address that pops up here at the bottom of the screen, LP4, letter L, letter P, number 4, at zoominternet.net. So if you've got any feedback or comments about the program, we certainly would like to hear from you, and that's how you can reach us. And if you want to go back and check out a previous episode of Chapters, we've also made that available for you through the YouTube page, Armstrong One Wire Chapters page on YouTube. All you need to do is go to www.youtube.com/Armstrong One Wire, and from there find the Chapters tab, and you can go back and look at over 50 episodes of author, publisher, and editor interviews that we've done here on the program. And we know many of you have done that. Many of you have left comments in the comments field for some of those episodes that you've watched, and we appreciate that so much. So if you want to go back and check out another episode, that's where you can do it, and the address there is right here at the bottom of the screen. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.